Hello, everyone. I guess it's 11 o'clock, so we should get things started. Yeah, just to kick things off, this has been such a cool summit already, and I'm so excited for us to get going. It's so wonderful to see all of you here today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Tali Diener. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a high school student in Michigan, and I'm the Campaigns and Public Policy Director for JRCM, and I'll be helping to moderate this. Sasha, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So my name is Sasha Calvert. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a junior at Brookline High School in Massachusetts, and I'm part of the Actions and Advocacy team on the JYCM National Board.
Perfect. So just to give a little background for those that don't know, JYCM is a part of Hazone. So we do our own thing, but we're also really excited to be a part of Hazone things. So a little background on it. It was founded this year, and we're dedicated to mitigating climate change by empowering teens, mobilizing our communities, and taking actions. We believe in using Jewish values as a motivation to create a more equitable and sustainable world for all. We have a lot of projects and events going on, and you can check out our calendar in this link. I think someone's going to post. But also, before we begin, we want to acknowledge that everyone here, wherever we are, is on stolen land from Native Americans. We're not truly being sustainable climate activists or helping save the planet if we do not acknowledge all of the harm that has been done and is continuing to be done to Native Americans. This is just a small step, and we have a long way to go to decolonization. I'm living on Ojibwe and Potawatomi land, but we're all in different places. Please drop in the chat whose land you're on and your name and your pronouns. And if you don't know, you can use this link to learn that I'll put in the chat. So please introduce yourselves and your land and your pronouns. Thank you. So great to see everyone. And also, if you're able, please turn on your camera. It makes it feel like we're all here together in a room, even though we're virtual.
Okay, so you can continue typing what land you're on in the chat, but we're going to move on to now introduce our lovely panelists. So we're going to start with Yoshi Silverstein. Yoshi Silverstein is the founder and executive director of Mitsui Collective, Cleveland community organizer for ADOPE, the Midwest Regional Jewish Diversity Collaborative, a cohort 6 Schusterman Fellow, and director emeritus of the Joffe Fellowship at Hazone. A Chinese Ashkenazi American Jew, Yoshi is also an active speaker, advocate, and educator in the Jews of color community and speaks regularly on diversity, equity, and inclusion as one person should reasonably do. And inclusion. As a fellowship junkie, he's been part of probably too many different cohort-based programs than one person should reasonably do. He has also studied permaculture design and eco-village design and has a master's degree in landscape architecture with a thesis for exploring Jewish frameworks, concepts, and vocabularies for landscape design and outdoor learning. Yoshi lives in Cleveland area with his wife, daughter, and pup. So we can all give some virtual snaps for Yoshi. We're very excited to have him here. Okay.
Great to be on.
Our next panelist is Sue Salinger. Sue Salinger is the executive director at Ikar Farm, Denver's 2-acre Jewish urban communal farm and garden. She is committed to building community resilience and food equity by connecting people to each other and to the earth. Ikar grows 17,000 pounds of food as direct aid and works with over 30 grassroots and mainstream food systems organizations to repair the food system. Grounded in the ancient earth-based Jewish wisdom tradition, Sue brings several decades of transformational earth-based systems, project design, and execution to Ikar Farm. So let's give some virtual snaps to Sue now.
Glad to be here.
All right. So now we have Sabrina Sergina. So she is a Shaliach Tzibur, a Jewish spiritual leader serving communities in metropolitan Washington and unaffiliated and independent Jews across the country. The creator of Training the Heart to Listen, she is nationally recognized as an effective facilitator, speaker, writer, Torah commentator, and meditation leader. As a self-reflective person, she uses her life lessons to inform all her work. So we'll give some snaps to her now. And then last but certainly not least, we have Denise Abdul Rahman, and she is the Indiana State Conference of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Chair and a staff member of the National NAACP Environmental Climate Justice Program, ECJP, as the regional field organizer for the Midwest and Plain States. Denise holds a BS in Management, MBA in Healthcare Management, and a Health Informatics designation from Indiana University School of Informatics. Currently, she serves on the Midwest Renewable Energy Association Board of Directors, and she has served as a delegate to Paris COP21, delegate to Global Climate Action Summit, former vice chair Indianapolis Air Pollution Control Board, and an advisor for the Thrive Indianapolis Climate Action Plan. So let's give virtual snaps to her and to all of our speakers. So now we're going to get started on our questions for the next 50 minutes. If you all wouldn't mind, if you could hold your questions until the end, where we'll have about 5 minutes for some question and answers with the panelists. So our first question, and this is for everybody, is what is environmental racism to you? How has it shown up in your life, and how has it affected you?
Whichever panelist wants to start, go for it.
I'll jump in. I'll break the ice. Hi, everyone. Yoshi Silverstein. It's really nice to be on here with you. So I grew up in Spokane, Washington, which is 20 minutes from Idaho. It's in Eastern Washington, not near Seattle. There's a mountain range and a desert in between. And I went to preschool in a Montessori preschool that was literally housed inside of an arboretum. And so when we, and I'm gonna remove my own spotlight because I want to be able to see everybody. So when we had recess, we were just literally out in the arboretum, like climbing trees and going through tunnels and like the brush and like occasionally falling into the duck pond, which is great when you're 4. But it was a pretty amazing way to like go to preschool, and it's probably a not insignificant reason that, you know, I have done all of the work that I've done and continue to do. So I was tremendously lucky. And one of the things that I was, of course, not aware of at the time, but have become increasingly aware of, is the way in which, for a number of different reasons, I had access to that kind of an incredible and foundational educational experience when I was young. And there are so many children and families who don't have anywhere near that access, sometimes to zero early, childhood education, let alone one that is so immersive and enriching. So on the one hand, from the very start, I had access to these opportunities that particularly folks of other races often have not had. At the same time, both of my backgrounds, I'm Chinese on my mom's side and my dad's side is Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish. These are also both people that have been forced in different ways to leave their ancestral lands. And so at the same time, there's a severing of connection and a sort of lack of rootedness in place that I think in many ways is something that I've been searching for and trying to answer my entire life. So when I think about environmental racism, I really think about what some people have called the sort of double original sin of the founding of this country, which is that both the forced removal of the people who were originally indigenous to this land in order to clear the way for colonial settlers coming from other lands. Yes, in some cases, fleeing persecution, but nonetheless, stealing land from the folks who are originally here. And at the same time, stealing other people, folks mainly from Africa, from their lands to come and be the labor force in this land and to enslave them. And so, we can get into lots of specifics in terms of the ramifications and the specific details of how these things play out. But I think to me, it really stems from, so much of it stems from those really original harms that we still continue to face today, that we have not come anywhere close to fully healing. And that's where I still really sort of ground myself in my work, is thinking, how do we heal? How do we move forward? How do we strengthen everyone's ability to be in relationship to land and nature and to all of its nourishing, healing benefits?
Thank you, Yoshi. I'll go next. I was really struck by the fact that you were asked the question about what does it mean to me, because most of my work is around diversity and multiculturalism, racial equity, diversity, equity, and for the longest time, the work I was doing, it was in the mid to late 1980s. I started meeting people of color who were involved in the environmental movement, and we often talked about that they were either the only one, or when they were showing up at places with a large group of people of color, they were marginalized. And that changed a little bit when there was an EPA report that came out in the late 1980s. There was a lot that had the facts about the impact of environmental degradation on communities of color. And then there was a leadership summit in 1991. And I think it was the first time that a lot of us were in the same room with so many people who, from so many communities, who were concerned about environmental justice. And it's really only been the last 5 years that I've really seen a transformation from environmental work to environmental justice work across the whole gamut of organizations. And the last few who had not done so have done so in the last few months. And I think that's it. So for me, since I have the large work that I've taken on myself in terms of diversity, it's something that we as people of color have always taken seriously, and have been left out of the larger movement until really very recently.
Hi, this is Denise Abdul-Rahman. I'll just add my frame or my thinking is that environmental racism has shown up before I was born. 401 years ago, my African descendants were packed onto a ship via the transatlantic slave trade. And they survived the enslavement and endured Jim Crow segregation and redlining and what we call James Crow, the brother of Jim Crow or the new Jim Crow, via the mass incarceration. And Michelle Alexander coined it best when she called about the so-called war on drugs. And then the school to prison pipeline and the calculations of the projected funding allotments and contracts drawn for the purpose of privatization, in which our scholars are identified by third grade. And the term environmental racism was coined by Benjamin Chavis in 1982. And he termed it as racial discrimination in environmental policy making, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, and the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding. And then Chavis and Dr. Robert Bullard pointed out that institutional racism that is stems from government and corporate policies that are leading to environmental racism, and that these practices include redlining and zoning and colorblind adaptation plans. And in the legacy of the American apartheid and environmental racism, Dr. Robert Bullard said that environmental racism refers to any policy, practice, or directive that is differentially affects and or disadvantages, whether it's intended or unintended, on individuals, groups, or communities based on race and color. And basically that the term of environment is understood to be basically where we can live, work, play, learn, pray. And most people want to have this equal access to recreation and safe neighborhoods. And so I say all that also to say that my frame of environmental racism is also very broad. It's everything from police brutality to the lack of investments in our educational system and overall systemic racism that makes it hard to live in society equitably and justly.
Denise, Sabrina, Yoshi, it's an honor to be able to be on a panel and hearing from you and learning from you and speaking with you today. For me, I grew up in Detroit, and environmental racism, the clearest way my understanding of environmental racism can be communicated is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color, people in communities of color. And environmental justice is the movement's response to that, to try to rectify the, equalize, change, eliminate this discrepancy in whose bodies the result of our industrial society, capitalist society play out on. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. I worked for a long time with Free Speech TV, which is an alternative media organization where we covered environmental racism. And I just want to mention two stories that just brought home to me. I come from a white Jewish Ashkenazi background where while we're all bleeding heart liberals, it's academic really until you get into communities and see what's happening. While we carry our own history of discrimination and extermination, for most of us, we've lived in America where that kind of pain hasn't been put onto our community, and God willing, we'll be able to make sure that all communities won't have to experience this. In Detroit, 99% historic Black community, and all of the trash in Michigan up until very recently, when the area where the trash incinerator is located was gentrified, was where all of metropolitan Detroit's trash got burned. And the community living around that trash incinerator had the highest rate of emphysema and asthma, and the children were more incidents of sick children because of that, and elders who were ill because of that than anywhere else in the country. And that's an example of sighting, out of sight, out of mind of communities that hold enough power to prevent that from being in their backyard. It's completely unequal. I'll also say that we covered Katrina, and when Katrina hit, we had the chance to work with the founding member of Louisiana's Black Panther Party, Malik Rahim, who's been working for community, with his community for so long. When Katrina hit, which I would say is an incident, as all of our climate catastrophes are these days, of our own actions. When Katrina hit, the community was devastated. The Black community was driven out of its homes, could not come back, was shot, left for dead, bodies left for dead. And just a tiny bit away from New Orleans, where Malik was working, it's the historic Cancer Alley, where all of the industrial toxic factories are located and sited in Black communities. So the community in New Orleans was hit so hard, residents could not come back. Residents were disenfranchised from voting because they had to leave the area. And a community was just wiped out. That's environmental racism. Who has the resources to move, to leave an area that is bad, who can set up somewhere else? So I agree with Denise. It's not, environmental racism is part of an unjust economic system where everyone does not have equal. The widows, orphan, and stranger don't have, however we in the Jewish community want to frame anyone who is in our community who is not of our small clan, how we can take care of everybody. So it's I think it's what drives all our work.
Wow, thank you, everyone. All of those responses were so meaningful and powerful, and I have learned a lot already. Our next question is, some of you have touched upon this, but to ask it more explicitly, where have you seen the most growth in the environmental justice movement in recent years, and how has it empowered the work that you do? And we don't need everyone to answer every question, so if you feel called to, please go for it.
This is Denise. I'll just say on this, yes, agreeing with Sue that it has to do with the movement's response. So it's everyone that is in networks that I've connected with across the nation, that are working on shared principles and working on shared understandings and sharing research, formulating and working together to shape local and state and federal policy. So I've seen a lot of growth in that area, and this growth is more important than ever because it helps us to empower our members in the NAACP, which we have over 2,500 chapters across the nation. And so we are able to connect our members to different folks that are working in the movement. And then it helps the communities to be able to work on their transformation and their liberation.
So I'll just say I've been working in both secular and Jewish outdoor and food farming and environmental education for the better part of 20 years, which is, like, depending on how you look at it, not a long time, and is a long time, but it's certainly long enough to have seen some changes happen. And when I first got into the work, very much noticed, and this still is an issue, but you know, the outdoor education space is being absolutely predominantly white. That's still largely true. But I think also thinking about, you know, this sort of pervading assumption that, like, people of color just weren't that interested in it, right? So seeing that shift and then going from there into saying, like, oh, like, well, of course we should provide access to. I worked in the Olympic Mountains for with Olympic Park Institute, which said, oh, let's work with our funders to create a scholarship program so that, you know, inner city kids can come out and have these beautiful experiences. And they were beautiful and powerful, and, like, those are, you know, some amazing groups of kids to work with. But I think even within that, there was an assumption that like the work we are doing is awesome and great. We just need to create more access to it. And that's true on some level, for sure. But I think really, especially in the last few years, what I've seen, and that really I am inspired by it, is also sort of like turning the lens a little bit more inwards and saying, yes, we have to address the structural and economic things, absolutely, and the work we're doing is not perfect, and thinking about, like, what are the ways in which we are, as educators, as nonprofit organizations, right, as and creating the programs, what are the ways that we need to do our own auditing of the things that we're doing to contribute to this, and how do we move from being this sort of like a blank space that we just need to open up the doors bigger to get folks in, to actually saying, what do we need to do differently to actually move into an anti-racist, proactive standpoint? And so I think, you know, and particularly in the Jewish world, I think really even just within the last 2 years, there's been, thankfully, a lot of a shift in momentum. Better late than never. But I think it's also still quite young, and something that I hope that everyone is really just continuing. Like, it's gonna be a long haul. So I hope folks are continuing to find the, you know, source of nourishment, but really to continue and move into that work.
I'll say that there used to be, you know, we're all in lineages of movements. There used to be a Black-Jewish alliance in the civil rights era. When the Great Migration from the South came up to the industrial North and to Detroit, when the Jewish communities at the same time were migrating in from being driven out of Europe, the communities lived in the same neighborhoods, worked side by side, and had a long history of sharing and struggle for equity and for justice. And what I'll give a shout out to that I've seen that's encouraging, although I will say that each of the organizations I'm going to mention aren't focusing on the environment, and we can urge them to do so more. But I'm really happy to see groups like the JFREGs and Detroit Jews for Justice, local chapters of Bend the Arc, the Join for Justice nationally training, all of the work that is available now to train this current generation of young Jewish activists to stand up and take part and in their communities, center the work of the communities most impacted, almost always communities of color. It's really encouraging to see.
Okay, so unless Sabrina, unless you have anything to say, I think we're going to move on to the next question. Okay, so our next question ties into this one that Tali just asked, but we're asking, how can the general climate movement center environmental justice more centrally and fundamentally? And again, you all touched on it, but just to ask it more explicitly. And again, nobody is compelled to answer. This question is open to anybody who feels so inclined to do so.
I will start because one of the things that I repeatedly find is that people feel like if they reduce the barriers, that's all they need to do. And without going into a rabbinical story, which would be very easy for me to do, I'm just going to move right to the point that it's not enough to have the doors open or to ease access. The people inside have to be deliberately welcoming, which means that and that means working on their own racism and equity, to be mindful of who's on their staff, who are their volunteers, what is the makeup of their boards. It's all of that is what really creates a welcoming environment, and doing the work of talking to one another as staff, as volunteers, about the ouches as they occur. Because none of us are perfect, and if there's one thing that this country is good at, it's about not talking about anything that will cause conflict. And race is the biggest thing that we avoid talking about in terms of that. So I think it's great that all of these organizations finally have a statement about environmental racism and environmental justice. However, that's the skeleton. There really needs some muscle and some meat on those bones. And because most of their organizations are still very, very white, most of their pictures on their websites are still very, very white. And even being in partnership with people who are on the ground, I think there's also has been much of a white savior complex within the environmental movement and climate change movement. And that just needs to stop. Come partner with us, because we've been doing a lot of work on our own for a long time.
Denise, were you about to jump in?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No. Okay. So I feel like we can just say like everything is building on everything, and everyone is saying amazing things. So building on that, I think I think also really about the work that we do to center the voices of people of color. The voices, the leadership, the knowledge, I think, and the funny thing is when, there's a decentering or a shifting that has to happen at the same time, right? Like you can't necessarily, there are ways which we can do both at the same time, and then ways that we aren't. And so, I think we have to really audit also our assumptions that we make, and the ways, listen, we're talking about racism. We have to, let's also name that we're also then talking about white supremacy, and white supremacy racially, the supremacy of like the Western quote unquote world. We're also talking about the supremacy of like forms of knowledge, and, attitudes towards the world. And so there's ways in which, for example, we talk like the big we, or, people talk about, humans are fundamentally flawed in our relationship to the way that we consume resources, and that like this is just human nature, and that like that will just so that's a pervasive idea that's out there, but that's actually even as it's a critical idea, there's also this like embedded white supremacy in that, which is assuming that actually something that is a facet of colonialism and exploitation and white supremacy, which I would say is a thread that clearly some humans have, and that has been taking over, but we should be careful not to assume that all humans everywhere have that, right? Because in fact, there are a lot of communities and people around the world who were doing quite nicely, thank you, in their relationship to the environment and their consumption of resources before these, these exploitative and invasive, forces came through and shifted that relationship entirely out of whack. And so, when we're talking, and those communities tend often to be communities of color, communities from around the world. And so when we're thinking about where we're centering voices, we also need to be centering, who do we turn to for sources of knowledge? We can simultaneously hold up science, right? We don't need to throw science away, but let's also acknowledge that there are different ways of knowing things. There's different ways of being in relationship, and to really turn to those people and to those ways of knowing and hold them up equally. Because that's science did as much to get us into this mess as it will to get us out of it. And so we cannot turn only to science, right? We have to be really thinking about all the different other aspects that are going to get us through this.
One thing that I think about a lot, Yoshi, that's so great. One thing I think about a lot is that it seems to me we're in a certain way in the environmental movement, we're kind of in a weak moment. The crisis has been going on for so long and building for such a long time. There was a lot of action that changed a lot of laws in the 60s and 70s. And politically, it's who's got clout now. So with the Green New Deal coming up and louder, more voices throughout the system speaking out, I think that that's something. But I mean, we don't have the Jewish wing of the environmental movement. We don't have the environmental movement conference or gathering. We don't have a unified plan to address multiple levels of the problem. So I think I think we don't have an environmental justice wing of the environmental movement because we don't really have a clear environmental movement. So I think in a certain way, we should, as soon as COVID's over, have a huge gathering somewhere. Probably can't wait that long. But I think that as a movement, I think we just need to coalesce and develop a movement. There's a lot of interesting individual players doing different aspects of the work. Miralay on this call is doing some of it. Diane's doing some of it. Hazan's doing some of it. But as a whole movement, it seems like we have work to do.
This is Denise. First, for me, the climate movement and environmental justice movement are inextricably interwoven. They're not separate. They're one. And I think it's a fallacy for there to be a climate movement without having environmental justice, because the BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, are the communities most impacted by greenhouse gas emissions and their co-pollutants. And these are the same communities that are keenly vulnerable to the impacts of climate, to high energy burdens, to the lack of shade and vegetation, living in food apartheid communities, and that are vulnerable and in need of resilience. And I think that if there's this separatism of the climate movement versus environmental justice and the need to center it, then I suppose it would be eliminating the idea of carbon markets as being a solution. Environmental justice and climate justice leaders know that we need to get to the root causes and that we can't use geotechnological fixes, and also to employ the HAMES and the environmental justice principles. And I would also say, which I have seen, there just has to be lots and lots of conversations and shared understanding with the climate justice, environmental justice, which is really all the same, to really center it. Otherwise, in my view, it's really an unjust movement. It's an inequitable movement, and it's more of the same, the status quo. And if you, insanity, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result.
I so appreciate what you said, Denise, and agree with it wholeheartedly. The one other thing I want to add to that is that right now, the majority of people in the world, as well as the majority of people in this country that are impacted by climate change events are people of color. Most of them are located in the global South. And that's part of the problem, is that they're not cared for. And most of the people who are displaced persons in this world right now are displaced because of climate, and not because of war. War is second, climate is first. And it's an important thing to understand, that a lot of the places where there's conflict, people are not leaving mostly because of the conflict. They're leaving because of environmental degradation that they're experiencing, especially along their shorelines, but not also in their forests. And they're running out of supplies. All of those things come together to impact what they're doing. In this country, we have brownfields that are still not clean. Where are they located? They're located next to people of color communities. And a lot of those communities are boxed off away from everybody else deliberately by roads and other barriers that keep them hard to get to, and therefore also out of sight, out of mind. So it's not just centering our voices and our experiences, it's really looking at the whole, as Denise says, looking at the whole thing as one thing that needs to be done. Different aspects, and it's going to take all of us to do it. Even me, who is over here doing the work, some other kind of work, I'm very much connected to this, and I also keep very up to date in terms of the things that are going on, and will do specific things that I can do, including being here today. But it is a fallacy that as Denise says, and I'm just reinforcing it, it is a fallacy that there's an environmental movement and a climate movement. It has to be one movement. And environmental climate justice has to be for everyone in this world. This is one world, one boat. We can't save some and have other people who will not be, who can go away. Because if there's just one of us that's endangered, we're all in danger.
There's one more thing I want to say before we move on, and apologies to our moderators. You're doing great, and we're just picking up some steam. But I think just something to name here that I think is really important, and is not doesn't replace the reasons that we're talking about this, but I think is an important augmentation, and especially when we're talking in a Jewish context about this, and to really name, when we're thinking about these conversations, we're thinking about the us and the them. First of all, naming that is part of the language that's coming up, us and them. But to think about, well, who's the them and who's the us, and actually who's part of us, and that, right? And so on the one hand, I would absolutely personally consider it a Jewish value to be thinking both of our own community and of other communities, be they communities of color or otherwise, right? But that we're not in this by ourselves, that our liberation is bound in the liberation of everyone. And in a way that I think, whether it's for the folks on this call or when you're talking to others, but to also bring it home in a somewhat more personal way, is to remember that Jews of color exist. We've got several of them here on this panel, and also I'm seeing, in the folks who are in the Zoom in general. Hi, I'm really glad you're here. And so to remember that when we're talking about people of color, we are also talking about Jews. And when we're talking about Jews, we're also talking about people of color. And we could go on this for a whole other hour, and obviously we won't, but the most recent data shows that 12 to 15% at minimum of the American Jewish community are people of color. And that number is only going to continue to rise as, more babies keep happening, right? And it's going to follow the same trend lines that the American community in general is becoming blacker and browner. And so when we're talking about environmental racism, yes, we're talking about the relationship of Jewish community to other communities, but we're also talking about our relationship to ourselves. And if we know that people of color in general disproportionately are affected and impacted by racism and by environmental issues, et cetera, some of those people are Jews. And so if we believe, even if only we believe in like Klal Yisrael, I think hopefully we believe in beyond that too, but even if only that, we should know that we're also talking about Jews when we're talking about these things.
Wow, thank you so much, everyone. All those answers were so insightful. Sorry, my dog is barking. We have one last question for all of the panelists, which I think I can see people in the chat are kind of thinking about too, is what would you say to audience members wanting to get more involved in environmental justice efforts or movements pursuing related issues? And we'd like everyone to answer this question.
Just before we get to that, we have about 7 more minutes. So if we have time, if we want time for questions at the end, then we do have to keep that in mind.
So the first thing I would say to anyone wanting to get involved in the environmental justice efforts or movement is first go outside. Go outside, grow some food, be outside, meet your community. Food pantries, community gardens, great place to start to meet people, and take a couple of your friends with you and try to share some meals with people that you don't know who are in your community. And in the what I mean by community is your neighborhoods, the areas around you, your cities, and get involved on the ground. And of course, vote.
I ditto that, and I add that I think it's very important that we stop being afraid. We've been taught to be afraid of somebody who's different from ourselves, which is counterintuitive. It's counter to our traditions, which says we are to engage with one another. So I encourage you to be with whatever fears and anxieties and recognize that the first time of meeting people, we often make mistakes. And don't let that making a mistake cause you to not stay in the conversation with people. That is the biggest fear, is that I'm going to make a mistake, I'm going to say something stupid. Well, chances, I don't know that there's a day that goes by that I don't say something stupid. Hopefully not the same thing throughout the day. But so it's just about a willingness to put oneself forward and to be vulnerable, which is not something that we're taught to do. However, when we're willing to be our genuine selves, it's hard for somebody else to use that against us.
Sabrina, that's perfect to segue to what I was going to say, which is similar to working in climate, justice, climate work in general. If you're only coming at this, there's tons of challenges in this, of course, and that we have to address and really look at square in the eye. And if you're only approaching the work from a place of shame and guilt, you're going to burn out real quick. And so you need to find, and so the same with talking about like racial equity, racial justice, right? Like you need to find your source of joy in this work, the things that nourish you directly from this work and allow you to sustain in it. And I think, to me, a huge one of that has been the relationships, right? Being in relationship to other people, being in relationship, of course, to nature and to place. But to really be in relationship, to be in chavruta and create those chavrutas. But it also requires, like you're saying, Sabrina, like bringing in your full self. Because if you're leaving part of yourself behind, there's no way that you're gonna, you're actually doing a disservice to like the people on the other side of that relationship if you're not also really bringing in yourself to it. And like we have to be able to bring our whole selves into the work. We can't just do it, halfway.
Denise, I'll just say real quick that a great leader once said to me, Julian Bond, if you don't use your voice, no one can hear you. And so I would say use your voice and bring your narrative, because many times we presume that certain narratives are the truth or the one and only narrative. And something that I've learned is to speak my own truth, which is my own experience and the way that I see the world and how it should morph. And then people can see either connectivity to that So find your voice, tell your story of your ancestries. I usually do that. I talk about how I come from a long line of freedom fighters and see it all connected, in my view, to our human and our civil rights. And connect with people, because I find that the most important aspect to me is around building relationships. So many conversations. The more conversations you have, really, the more movement, the more understanding, the more synergy that you have. And there's a whole lot of networks out there, especially for young people. And this is your charge as young people, if that's who we have predominantly, although it's an intergenerational movement. But the time is now to place yourself and to move. You can organize any group in your local area, pass ordinances, just state some kind of a youth platform, just start doing the work, because it's all hands on deck. Thank you.
Perfect. I think that's everyone sharing. Thank you so much. That was all so exciting and inspiring. We have time for one question from the audience. And so if you want to just raise your hand and we can unmute you. And before we go to the last question, we're going to send some follow-up resources about all of these things later today. And we can't wait to keep continuing these conversations. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
I think I saw Carly had a raised hand.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I'm wondering what panelists think Hazon's role or potential role, or what our work could look like in environmental justice realm.
I've got well, it's not easy, but it is relatively simple. Hazon has always, not always, but well, since the time Hazon has existed, has always been one of the drivers of the Shemitah conversation. And I know clearly that's part of ongoing work. I would really love to see specifically the relationship to land and Jewish institutional relationship to land, and what Shemitah means in terms of reparations. In that context, I would love to see that being a central focus of the next Shemitah year, and really encouraging, like I was saying in the last session, I don't think we don't have as much land as the Catholics, but we've got a lot of land that is part of Jewish institutions. And so what would it look like to really rethink whether it's through actual returning of the land or through land taxes? There's a lot of different ways, it starts with relationship, but to really push that forward and use the next conversation of Shemitah and the release of land as a way to really have that conversation.
I'll build on the wonderful things that Yoshi just said. I think something Hazon could do is to, when it activates its seal of sustainability sites, congregations and organizations that it works with in the Jewish community, if there is a way to shift those organizations' work so that they see themselves as resources to not just their Jewish members, but to the communities in which they are geographically located in. So that might look like, how do you use that land as a cooling center? How do you use that land to provide food for people? So whatever the resilience issues that we're going to need to address and grow into in the coming years, the coming 5 years, 10 years, Hazon can help drive that shift in how the Jewish community sees itself as integrally involved with the places in which it operates.
And I'll add, there's roughly 1 million plus Jews of color, and a lot of us are in synagogues and either very active to marginally like everybody else. How incorporative are those organizations in terms of the voices of Jews of color, the presence of Jews of color? What are the materials that are there ongoing materials? Do we appear in them, or are all the pictures of people of color who are from the outside community, as opposed to those of us who are inside the community? that's an environmental issue as well.
Okay, considering that we are over time, we are going to have to wrap up now. But before we go,
We can go a little bit over time. It's okay for a little bit over time. We have a 10-minute break in between, so, and it's in this room, so anybody who wants to stay can just stay.
okay, well, in that case, Denise, maybe if you'd like to answer that question and then we can close.
Well, I'm with the NAACP. I would just say, connect with the NAACP, join any of our committees around the nation, and, give voice that's, intersectional and interconnected is one way. And then I really liked what I think Sue said about, building the different gardens and access for community. And you could bring in other community folks and have conversation, have forums and work together and shared collaborative work and, build together. So, thank you.
And before we close, I'd like to add something to what I don't remember who said this about partnerships between the Jewish community and the Black community in the civil rights era. Over the last few years, I've become aware of a treasure trove of documents at Howard University that makes it clear that the partnership between the Black community and the Jewish community go back to the late 1800s. And that specific academic space. There might be other academic spaces. And I also think it's important that anytime we talk about Black Jewish relationships, that we make sure and make clear that when we talk about Jewish, we're talking about all Jews, including Jews of color, as opposed to continuing the fallacy that all Jews are white.
Thank you so much, Yoshi, Sue, Sabrina, and Denise. We appreciate your time, insight, and leadership. This concludes the Environmental Racism panel. I hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
Thank you, Sasha and Tali, for all your hard work on this.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Hazones,
Sue,
for putting it together.
Yes, thank you, Hazones.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Hazones.
Tali, Sashi, Rabbi, Nick. Thank you.
Yeah.